I started getting involved in different housing ministries in addition to advocacy, and I'll be talking about our advocacy in a little bit, but I learned about Family Promise. How many of you know Family Promise, what that is? It's just a wonderful program. Well, there was a gal named Karen Roberson who was starting that in Pasadena, and I thought, wow, the idea of using a church as a place for someone to stay who's homeless. What a beautiful idea, you know, and helping them until they're able to get back on their feet. So I learned about this national program. There's now over 200 networks across the country where they rotate within a network of 14 churches, between 12 and 14 churches, and they stay for 1 week, and then they transfer to the next church. And it works. It absolutely works. And so I wanted to mention that. I'd like to see, I help recruit most of the churches for the one in San Gabriel Valley, but it's mostly in the western part of San Gabriel Valley. I see a need for this in the eastern part of the valley. And so I'm praying today that there may be people here that would see the need to start a new network in eastern part of San Gabriel Valley. Safe parking, this is not something I've started, but it's something I've dreamed about, and I'm still dreaming about it. I know that Luke Ellison has been dreaming about some of that too, but we need leadership to begin to dream together. Santa Barbara has identified 133 parking places in churches and nonprofits throughout the city. They've won national and even international recognition for the work they're doing there. It's part of New Beginnings Counseling Center. Everyone's part of case management, and they're all committed to making sure those people that are enrolled that sleep in their cars end up getting housed. They house approximately 10 people a month, which is very impressive. San Diego also has a program called Dreams for Change, and rather than having a scattered site model, they have just 2 or 3 different larger parking lots where everybody stays together. The next slide is another opportunity where individuals stay in a meeting house. So Quakers are different. I'm married to a Quaker. Quakers sit in silence for an hour on Sunday mornings and listening to God and how God is speaking to you. It's a very interesting way to worship. And there's a Quaker meeting house. Rather than calling it a church, they call it a meeting house because you meet God in that place. And so this little old lady in Claremont, she said, I'm seeing homeless people. There's homeless people here. And they said, no, not in Claremont. No. I see homeless people. And so she says, I'm going to count them. So she took it upon herself to count. You know, we all count. You look at the Bible and there's lists of people counted, one after the next. You know, Schindler's List. People count. And so because of that, then they were able to raise money and do an official count. They found 50 homeless people. And then she says, well, what do we've got space that's just sitting here, unused. So they partnered with this group called CHAPS, and there's between 10 and 11 people that stay in their meeting house every single night throughout the year. And they're all part of case management. They have 2 mentors or advocates that work with them to help them get housed. And as soon as someone's housed, the people that are staying there are part of the leadership team. Those homeless people become part of the governance in making a decision who that next person will be that will move in. So it's a leadership development as well as just a wonderful model. So maybe something like that would happen here, to have some kind of a low-cost emergency shelter. I'm going to have Luke come up here for a minute and just tell what he does. He works primarily around making sure homeless get employment.
My name is Luke Ellison. I'm with Support Solutions Homeless Services. We have an office in Covina. We help homeless people find jobs. We started the program we're at 16 months ago in the Monrovia Public Library, working with a small group of people. And you know, there's a lot of need in the community when you're homeless and you're looking for employment. You have the traditional barriers like resume, interview practice, but you also have things like shelter, showers, transportation, and storage. We work hard. We work really hard to bring our program to people, but we don't work nearly as hard as the people who are in our program. We work with them to develop a plan for gaining employment, but they go to their interviews. They write their own resume, and when they eventually get that final yes, they show up to work. And most of our people are still employed. We have a very high success rate. The reason I'm telling you all that is because, well, the reason I'm here is simple. When you work with somebody who really does want the help, and my experience is that they do, when you work with them and put them through your budgeting workshop, and you know how much they make, and then you move on to the next step, which is housing navigation, and you look what's out there, market rate housing is not accessible for these people. Full-time workers, people who are living on the street, struggling to get the basics to make it to work. We need to do better for these people. Thanks for listening.
There's so many amazing programs like what Luke is doing, and we need all of us doing our part, all the gifts of the body of Christ, listening to that calling that God has given them. The calling that God has given to me is not so much in jobs or job creation, which you'll hear a little bit more about later, but in the cost of housing. How do you begin to lower that cost? I have this spiritual practice of reading the Bible and reading the newspaper every morning. And it's amazing how God speaks to me through both. There's hardly a day, I meant to bring the newspaper today, maybe you saw front page, a homeless person working for Disneyland who died in her car. And no one knew she was even living in a car. But when I read the newspaper a few years back, and I learned that Sayers Region, it's a developer out of Irvine, a Mormon developer, they were proposing 800 units in the city of Pasadena. And I said, 800 units? Oh my gosh, that's the biggest development ever in our city. I wonder if they know about our inclusionary housing policy. I wonder if they're gonna build the units, include the affordable units. And so that's when I called them. And I said, I'd like to meet with you guys. And they said, oh, sure. And, you know, developers are always eager to meet with someone because they want to make sure that they get their proposals passed. They want people to show up at the city council and support their efforts. So they were very eager to meet. And we sat down and I said, you know, I want to know what your plan is. Are you planning to include the inclusionary units, the 15% set aside that's required in our city? And they said, oh, yeah, I guess we'll do that, you know? And I said, so at what affordability level? So there's a number of different affordable levels. And I said, are you gonna do it at the moderate level, at the low income level, the very low, or the extremely low? And they said, well, we'll probably do it moderate. And I said, well, you know, I would love to support you, but I can't. And they said, oh, why not? It says, I only support those housing units that are at the much lower income levels. And they said, oh, okay. I said, so why don't you guys think about it? Let's get together in a couple weeks and I'll see what you guys decide, what income level you'll be providing housing. So in 2 weeks, we met. I said, so what's your decision? They said, well, you know what? We've decided not just to do the 15% requirement, we decided to do 20%. I go, wow. There's another development in Pasadena that chose 20% set aside. And then I said, so what income level? And they said, well, we're not going to do the moderate. We're not going to do the low. We're going to do them all for very low. And I thought, my goodness. So this is what resulted. In this development, there's 97 units, all embedded into high-end housing, all affordable for very low-income families. And it's development at its finest because it's close to shops, it's close to jobs, it's close to the Gold Line, so you can minimize parking. Well, they did the parking study twice. They said, you know, this is going to create so much traffic in our city. And the first one, they said it can't be that low. That doesn't make sense. And they made them do it again. It's very expensive to do a traffic study. It came out the same. It's because they had shared vehicles there for people to use. They had like a zip car. They were right next to the Gold Line. They had all these amenities that made it possible for them to minimize the number of cars. One of the most expensive parts of housing is cars and parking, believe it or not. If there's a way that you can cut down the number of parking places required, you can really cut down on the cost of housing. So what does this mean then for Monrovia? We've got a number of different income levels in this city. So according to the housing element, which I hope this will become the best friend of many of you, the housing element is essentially a plan that every city in the state of California is required to do that outlines how to plan for sufficient housing for all income levels. And so I looked in there, and it said that in 2014, there was about 4,500 households that earn lower incomes in this city, and that 23% of the extremely low income owners, or about 1,379 residents, 10% of the city, spend over 51% of their income on housing. You know, it's really hard to live when you spend such a high amount of your income on housing needs. Many of these are homeowners, so can you imagine they're at risk of losing their homes? So that's something that Monrovia needs to look at. Programs to help to keep people in their homes that they purchased, to keep them maintained. Then 2/3 of the 1,000, of about 1,057 are extremely low income renters. They spend more than half of their income. So these are people at risk of becoming homeless. So we have to keep people in their homes. It's much more expensive to get people housed after they're homeless. So it's very important that we look at homeless prevention. The housing wage, if you go to the National Low Income Housing Coalition website, they have something that's called Out of Reach. And so Out of Reach gives you what the housing wage is for all the different parts of the country. So when Luke talks about the importance of getting jobs and good jobs, our jobs, even good jobs, aren't enough to pay for the cost of housing today. The housing wage for California is $30 an hour in order to afford a 2-bedroom home. You would have to work 118 hours. Unless you're someone like myself who has a mortgage that'll be paid off this year. Many of us have that amazing privilege. But if you're a renter and you don't own, it could be a real problem. So I want to mention just briefly about the inclusionary program in Pasadena. This is up for review after a little over 20 years. We're looking at increasing this to at least 25%. The city of Santa Monica has increased their set aside at 30% of all new housing. If you think about 51% of folks spending over half of their income on housing, then you need to increase these set-asides. In cities like Pasadena, people are clamoring to develop and they're willing to set aside. And you think, you know, why would someone just do that? Why would they want to, people typically don't do it unless it's required. There's something called AB 1818, it's a density bonus law in the state. And so you can voluntarily set aside a percentage of your housing as affordable, and Monrovia has done that now, I think, for 11 units. But most people don't voluntarily do this or work the numbers until they're required to do it. So if you do the numbers and you get the density bonus that you're allowed if you include affordable units, you're way ahead. That's why the Sayers Regent, the Westgate development went to 20% set aside. It paid them to do affordable housing. They were able to include up to 35% more units in their development because they chose to do affordability. So we've built 527 units in Pasadena, all embedded in high-end housing throughout the city. And it's generated $20 million in funds for our city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. It's an excellent policy. This policy needs to take place here in the housing element for Monrovia. It says that you have this policy, but I think it's very weak. And this is something I think you all could work together and make sure that that's strengthened so that you can get all that area down by the gold line to capture a percentage of that to be affordable.
How does that work? So
How does it work? One of the developers, he called me and said, you know, I don't know that we're going to include the units. And I said, have you done the numbers? And he says, well, no. I said, do it. You might actually be ahead. And he did the numbers and figured out that by including the units in his development, he was able to do the density bonus. The state allows you to override the local density allowance. And by overriding the local density allowance, you can get up to even 35% more depending on the affordability level. And that's what paid for them being able to do those units. And the reason that the city got the inclusionary fees is because you have options. So with our policy, you have an option to include the units in the development. You can donate land, you can build units off-site, or you can give money. And so our fees right now are very low, and that's again up for review. We're trying to make those higher. But even with those low fees, we've been able to get over $20 million in inclusionary fees, where those developers chose not to include the units, but pay a fee to the city. So, does that make sense?
I get that part of it.
Okay. Yeah. So Nancy gets an award for coming the farthest. She came all the way from Indiana to come to this today. And I have known her precious mother, Carolyn, for years. I'm just thrilled to see them here today. Thank you. So, I love what the Pope said. Let me be clear, there is no social or moral justification, no justification whatsoever for the lack of housing. And there's a way to figure it out. And I'm gonna show this picture here. This changed my life. So if you want your life to be changed, write a book. So I looked at this book, as I was writing this book, I called my alma mater, Cal Poly, and I said, do I have all the models? Have I missed any ways that we can create affordability that have, you know, I want to make sure I have them all. And so someone mentioned Nehemiah Housing Program. I said, what is that? And so it didn't make any sense to me. I thought, how can they do this? This was 60 churches in New York that have built over 5,000 two-family homes, all for home ownership for low-income families. The churches themselves became their own developer. And they bought up huge swaths of property, built at scale, and were able to do amazing work in New York, completely changing those communities. They initially did the work in Brooklyn and then South Bronx. And that was the energy that began to turn those two communities around. And so I was changed by this. I took 2 trips to New York just to try to understand how on earth did these churches do this, and interviewed many of the people who were involved, so that chapter would make sense to me in my book. One of the other things I got involved with advocacy is Habitat. Now, how many of you have helped do a Habitat build? Anyone? Okay. Who's here from Habitat? Oh, thank you for coming. Wonderful. So I love Habitat. There's a whole chapter written by Millard Fuller that talks about the beginnings of Habitat, and Peachtree, a church in Presbyterian church in Atlanta that's done a huge amount of Habitat homes. But in Pasadena, we had an Army base underneath the Colorado Street Bridge. And the public policy says that that needs to be first for homeless veterans. And so we got busy looking at how we could use that land and build it for homeless veterans, some housing. And so the more we looked at this, it was amazing. All of these folks trying to give their proposals, and it was very disappointing. So much of what housing, there's a lot of compromise, and it's heartbreaking. I heard the mayor mention, Tom, how heartbreaking it is when we had a governor that chose not to support funding for affordable housing. And so I was thrilled to see Habitat make a proposal for 9 homeownership units on that property. But the density allowed for 70. And my heart broke. I thought, oh, But you know, it's in a high-end community, it's in West Pasadena, it's in an area where they probably never would have been open to higher density housing in that area. And it's really not an appropriate place for homeless housing because it's not close to amenities and jobs. And so my heart had to say, okay, I'm going to support this, and we're going to make this happen. And we had over 50 churches come to the city council, and we're able to get this passed. And I'm going to tell you one fun story. One of the kids in the STARS program who had ended up getting into a gang, and I said to David, I said, you know, David, his mom called me and says, Jill, I need some help with my son. I'm just not knowing what to do right now. And so I said, hey, David, let's go hang out. And we hung out at his high school. I brought him to the city council, and he was one of the ones holding the sign. He'd been doing graffiti around town. I said, now this is the right kind of graffiti, you know? This is appropriate here. So he ended up graduating. We started a whole program for gang prevention in the city because of him. So